The November rain hammered against the windows of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History's archive basement in Washington, D.C. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her fingers against her tired eyes, the fluorescent lights above flickering intermittently as they had done for the past 3 hours. She was 42 years old, a historical preservation specialist who had dedicated the last 15 years of her life to digitizing fragile photographs from the antebellum South. The work was painstaking, emotionally draining, and often thankless. But Sarah believed deeply that every face in every photograph deserved to be remembered, to be seen, to have their story told. Her colleague Marcus Washington sat across from her at the metal table, carefully handling a cardboard box that had arrived that morning from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. Marcus was 28, a recent PhD graduate specializing in African American history, with a particular focus on the visual documentation of slavery. His hands, steady and reverent, lifted each daguerreotype and tintype with the care one might give to holding a newborn child. "Sarah, look at this one," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying that particular tone she had learned to recognize over the years. It was the sound of someone who had found something significant, something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Sarah rolled her chair closer, the wheels squeaking against the concrete floor. The photograph Marcus held was a tintype, approximately 4 by 6 inches, its surface severely degraded by time and moisture. The image was almost completely obscured by silvering, that metallic deterioration that turned old tintypes into mirrors rather than windows into the past. But even through the damage, Sarah could make out the ghostly outline of a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of what appeared to be a plantation house. "Can you see his arm?" Marcus asked, angling the photograph under the LED desk lamp. "He's pointing at something. His whole body is turned, his arm extended, finger pointing directly at something off to the left of the frame." Sarah leaned in closer, her breath catching slightly. Marcus was right. Despite the severe deterioration of the image, the boy's posture was unmistakable. He was not posed in the typical stiff, formal manner of mid-19th century photography. Instead, his body language suggested urgency, purpose, defiance even. The boy's face was almost completely lost to the silvering, but his gestures spoke volumes. "What's the provenance on this?" Sarah asked, reaching for the documentation that accompanied the box. Marcus shuffled through the papers, his dark eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It came from the Whitmore estate. Robert Whitmore was a cotton plantation owner outside Charleston. The estate's sale happened after his great-great-granddaughter passed away last month. No living heirs. Most of the plantation records were destroyed during Sherman's March, but the family kept some personal items in a safety deposit box. This photograph was part of that collection. Sarah felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. Every photograph from this era carried stories of unimaginable suffering. Every enslaved face captured by the camera was a person who had been owned, who had been bought and sold like livestock, who had endured horrors that still echoed through American society 169 years later. The weight of that history never left her, never should leave her. "There's a note on the back," Marcus continued, carefully turning the tintype over. In faded brown ink, barely legible, were the words, "The boy Isaiah, 1856. Pointing at his lies." "Pointing at his lies," Sarah repeated slowly. "What does that mean? Whose lies?" Marcus shook his head, his expression troubled. "I don't know. But look at the way lies is written. It's ambiguous. Could be lies, as in falsehoods, or it could be a misspelling or dialect rendering of eyes. Hard to tell with 19th century handwriting." Sarah picked up her phone and took several high-resolution photographs of the tintype from different angles, capturing the way the light revealed different details depending on the viewing angle. "We need to get this into the AI restoration program. The new algorithm from the University of Maryland has been incredible with severely damaged images. If we can pull any additional detail from this, any clarity on what Isaiah was pointing at, it could be significant." "You think it's worth the processing time?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We have about 200 other items in this collection alone." Sarah looked at the photograph again, at the small figure of Isaiah frozen in time, his arm extended in that gesture of pointing, of showing, of bearing witness to something. She thought about how he would have stood perfectly still for what might have been 30 seconds or more, the primitive camera of 1856 requiring absolute stillness to capture an image. He had held that pose, maintained that gesture, made sure his pointing was captured for eternity. That was intentional. That was deliberate. Yes, Sarah said firmly. This one is worth it. Isaiah wanted someone to see what he was pointing at. He held that pose long enough to make sure it was captured. 169 years later, I think we owe it to him to try to see what he wanted us to see. Marcus nodded slowly, a small smile crossing his face. You know what I appreciate about working with you, Sarah? You never forget that these aren't just historical artifacts. These are people. Every single one of them had hopes, fears, dreams, loves. They deserve to have their stories told. And sometimes, Sarah said, carefully placing the tintype in a protective archival sleeve, they tell us their stories themselves if we're willing to listen. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Smithsonian Archive at 6 a.m., 2 hours before her official start time. She had barely slept, her mind turning over the image of Isaiah, the mysterious note on the back of the tintype, the urgency in his posture. She had seen thousands of photographs of enslaved people over the years, and most followed a predictable pattern. They were either posed formally, faces blank and expressionless, stripped of individuality by their enslavers who saw them as property rather than people. Or they were documented as part of racist ethnographic studies, subjected to dehumanizing pseudoscientific examination. But Isaiah's photograph was different. There was agency in that gesture, intentionality in that pointing finger. He had used the camera, perhaps the only power available to him in that moment, to document something, to testify to something, to ensure that someday, someone would see what he wanted them to see. Sarah made herself a strong cup of coffee in the break room and settled in at her workstation. The AI restoration system was a collaboration between the Smithsonian, the University of Maryland's Computer Science Department, and the National Archives. It used advanced machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of well-preserved historical photographs to essentially fill in the missing or deteriorated parts of damaged images. The results had been nothing short of miraculous, revealing details in photographs that had been considered too damaged to be useful. She uploaded the high-resolution scans of Isaiah's photograph, carefully inputting the metadata. Approximate date of 1856, location of Charleston area, tintype medium, severe silvering deterioration. The system would analyze the image, compare it to similar photographs from the same era and region, and attempt to reconstruct what the original clear image might have looked like. The processing time estimate appeared on her screen, 72 hours. Sarah sat back in her chair, sipping her coffee. 3 days. She could wait 3 days. She had waited years to help tell some stories. What was 3 more days? But she couldn't let it go. She opened a new browser window and began researching the Whitmore plantation. The digital archives were sparse for this particular property, most of the records having been destroyed during the Civil War as Marcus had mentioned. But she found references in Charleston city directories, mentions in contemporary newspapers, a few legal documents related to property transactions. Robert Whitmore Sr. had owned approximately 200 enslaved people in 1856. The plantation produced cotton and rice, using the brutal labor of those 200 souls to generate enormous wealth. Sarah found a newspaper advertisement from 1855 offering a reward for the return of a runaway slave named Isaiah, approximately 8 years old. The description matched the approximate age of the boy in the photograph. So Isaiah had tried to run. He had been caught and returned. And 1 year later, someone had taken his photograph. Slave owners did sometimes commission photographs of enslaved people, usually to document their property, for insurance purposes or estate planning. But the note on the back suggested something else entirely. The boy Isaiah, pointing at his lies. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. Found something about Isaiah. Meet me in the archive when you get in. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was 7:15 a.m. Marcus wasn't supposed to be in for another 45 minutes either. She grabbed her coffee and headed down to the basement archive. Marcus was at his workstation, surrounded by open books and his laptop displaying multiple browser windows. His eyes were red-rimmed, and Sarah suspected he hadn't slept much either. "I've been going through the Charleston City records," Marcus said without preamble. There was a trial in 1857, 1 year after that photograph was taken. Robert Whitmore Jr. was charged with the murder of an enslaved woman named Ruth. The case was eventually dismissed. No surprise there, prosecuting a white plantation owner for killing a slave was almost unheard of, and prosecutions that did happen rarely resulted in convictions. But the preliminary testimony is in the court records, and Isaiah's name comes up. Sarah set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "What did the testimony say?" Marcus turned his laptop to face her. On the screen was a scanned image of handwritten court documents, the old-fashioned script cramped and difficult to read. Marcus had helpfully highlighted the relevant passages in yellow. According to the preliminary testimony, Isaiah claimed to have witnessed the murder. He told other enslaved people on the plantation that he had seen Robert Whitmore Jr. kill Ruth near the overseer's cabin. The testimony was never allowed in court, of course. Enslaved people couldn't testify against white people. But the fact that it was even recorded in the preliminary documents is unusual. Sarah read through the passages Marcus had highlighted, her heart pounding. Isaiah had witnessed a murder. He had tried to tell people what he had seen. And he had been photographed 1 year before this trial, pointing at something with the caption, "Pointing at his lies." The lies weren't Isaiah's lies, Sarah said slowly, understanding dawning. Whoever wrote that caption was saying Isaiah was pointing at Whitmore Jr.'s lies. He was pointing at evidence of the murder. He was trying to show where it happened or where evidence was hidden. Marcus nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I think. And here's the thing that really gets me. I found one more document. Isaiah disappeared from the plantation records in 1858. No sale recorded, no death recorded, he just vanishes. Given that he had accused Robert Whitmore Jr. of murder, and given how slaveholders dealt with enslaved people who became problems, I think we can assume what happened to him." The weight of it settled over both of them. Isaiah had been probably 9 years old when he witnessed Ruth's murder. He had tried to tell the truth. Someone, perhaps someone sympathetic to him or who knew the truth, had arranged for his photograph to be taken, preserving his testimony in the only way available. And then Isaiah had been silenced, permanently, by the very system that had enslaved him. "We have to see what he was pointing at," Sarah said, her voice fierce. "We have to see what Isaiah was trying to show us. The AI restoration is processing now. 72 hours. "I'll keep digging through the historical records," Marcus said. "There might be more. Property surveys, maps, architectural drawings of the plantation. If we can figure out exactly where this photograph was taken, we might be able to piece together what he was pointing at, even if the restoration doesn't give us perfect clarity." For the next 3 days, Sarah and Marcus worked with an intensity bordering on obsession. Sarah checked the AI restoration progress every few hours, watching the percentage slowly climb. 20% complete, 40%, 60%. Marcus disappeared into archives, both physical and digital, tracking down every scrap of information about the Whitmore plantation, about Robert Whitmore Jr., about Ruth and Isaiah. On the 3rd day, at approximately 2 p.m., Sarah's computer chimed with a notification. The restoration was complete. She immediately called Marcus. "It's done. Get down here." Marcus arrived within minutes, slightly out of breath from running down 4 flights of stairs rather than waiting for the elevator. They stood together in front of Sarah's monitor, both afraid to click the file open. "You do it," Marcus said. "You found him. You should be the one." Sarah moved her cursor to the file and clicked. The restored image opened, filling her screen, and both of them gasped audibly. The restored photograph was extraordinary in its clarity. The AI algorithm had worked something close to magic, removing the silvering, enhancing the contrast, and revealing details that had been completely invisible in the original damaged tintype. Isaiah's face was now clearly visible, and what Sarah and Marcus saw there stopped them both cold. Isaiah couldn't have been more than 9 years old, with smooth dark skin and large eyes that held an expression far too old for his age. His clothing was ragged, a simple rough shirt that hung loosely on his thin frame. But it was his expression that seized Sarah's heart and wouldn't let go. There was defiance in those eyes, determination, and something else. Fear, yes, but also a fierce kind of courage. This was a child who knew he was bearing witness to something terrible, who knew there would be consequences, but who had decided that the truth mattered more than his own safety. His arm extended toward the left side of the frame, his index finger pointing directly at a specific spot. The AI restoration had revealed what he was pointing at with startling clarity. It was a wooden building, smaller than the main plantation house visible in the background. Based on the architectural style and the functional appearance, it was almost certainly the overseer's cabin. But that wasn't what made Sarah lean closer to the screen, her pulse quickening. There, at the base of the cabin, barely visible in the shadows beneath the raised floor, was something that looked like recently disturbed earth. A patch of ground that was darker than the surrounding soil, a rectangular shape approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered. "Is that a grave?" Sarah finished. Isaiah was pointing at where someone was buried. Where Ruth was buried. They stared at the screen in silence for a long moment. The implications were staggering. This photograph wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was evidence. Isaiah had used the camera to create a record of a crime scene, to mark the location of a murder victim's burial site. In 1856, when he had no legal standing to testify, when his words would never be believed in a court of law, he had found another way to tell the truth. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she began documenting what they were seeing. She took screenshots, made notes, prepared a detailed analysis of every visible element in the restored photograph. Marcus pulled up the historical maps he had found, trying to match the landscape features in the photograph to the known geography of the Whitmore plantation. "Here," Marcus said after several minutes of comparison. "I think I've got it. This rise in the background that matches the topography of the northeastern section of the Whitmore property. And look at this." He pulled up a property survey from 1860. The overseer's cabin was right here, about 200 yards from the main house. The property was sold in 1869, right after the war. The cabin was demolished in the 1880s, but the foundation might still be there. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "The property is now part of the Charleston Heritage Preservation Park," Marcus said, pulling up a contemporary map. "It's public land. The main plantation house was destroyed by fire in 1901, but large sections of the property have never been developed. If the overseer's cabin foundation is still there, if we could get permission to do a ground-penetrating radar survey, we might find Ruth," Sarah finished. "We might be able to give her a proper burial, tell her story, give her dignity in death that she was denied in life." The magnitude of what they were contemplating began to sink in. This wasn't just about historical research anymore. This was about justice, delayed by 168 years, but justice nonetheless. Ruth had been murdered, buried in a shallow grave, her death covered up by the very system that had enslaved her. Isaiah had tried to tell her story, had tried to mark where she lay, and had paid for that courage with his own life. "We need to document everything," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "Every step of this process needs to be recorded, peer-reviewed, transparent. This is too important to get wrong. We need historians, archaeologists, genealogists, community input. This isn't just our story to tell. It belongs to the descendants of the enslaved people of the Whitmore plantation, to the Black community of Charleston, to anyone with a connection to this history." Marcus nodded emphatically. "Agreed. We should start by reaching out to the Charleston African American Heritage Council. They've been working on plantation archaeology projects for years. They'll know the right protocols, the right people to involve." Over the next several weeks, Sarah and Marcus assembled a team. Dr. Patricia Lawson, an archaeologist from the College of Charleston who specialized in slave burial sites. James Turner, a genealogist who had spent decades helping African Americans trace their family histories back through the fragmentary records of slavery. Dr. Michael Robinson, a historian from Howard University who had written extensively about resistance and testimony during the antebellum period. And crucially, members of the Charleston African American Heritage Council, including Dorothy Hayes, a 76-year-old retired teacher whose great-great-grandmother had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. They met for the first time on a cold January morning at the Smithsonian, gathering in a conference room where Sarah and Marcus presented their findings. The restored photograph of Isaiah was projected on the large screen at the front of the room, his pointing finger directing their attention across time and space to that patch of disturbed earth beneath the overseer's cabin. Dorothy Hayes sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on Isaiah's face. When Sarah finished her presentation, Dorothy was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "That child," she said quietly, "that brave, beautiful child, he's been waiting 168 years for someone to see what he was trying to show us. My great-great-grandmother was named Ruth. I've searched for years to find out what happened to her, where she's buried. The records say she belonged to the Whitmore plantation, that she disappeared in 1856. I've always known in my heart she was murdered. Nobody just disappears. But I never had proof, never knew where to look." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. The room was absolutely silent. "I don't know if the Ruth in your family is the same Ruth who was killed," Dorothy continued, looking directly at Sarah. "But I know this. Every person buried in an unmarked grave on a plantation, every soul who died and was forgotten, they all deserve to be remembered. They all deserve justice. If you can find her, whoever she is, if you can give her name and dignity back, then you do it. You do it for her, for Isaiah, for all of them." Dr. Lawson leaned forward. "From an archaeological standpoint, this is feasible. We can get permission to survey the heritage parkland. Ground-penetrating radar is non-invasive. We don't have to disturb anything until and unless we confirm there's something there. If we do find evidence of remains, we follow proper forensic and spiritual protocols. The Charleston African American Heritage Council has established protocols for this kind of work." James Turner pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I've been doing genealogical research based on what Marcus found in the court records. I've identified 17 people who are likely descendants of individuals enslaved on the Whitmore plantation. They all deserve to be contacted, kept informed, given the opportunity to participate in this process." Dr. Robinson spoke last. "This photograph represents something extraordinary in the historical record. Enslaved people found countless ways to resist, to testify, to create records of their experiences. But actual physical evidence pointing to a specific crime, created by a child, preserved across nearly 2 centuries, this is unique. The story needs to be told carefully, respectfully, but it needs to be told." Over the next month, the team worked through the logistics. Sarah and Marcus prepared a detailed research proposal. Dr. Lawson secured the necessary permits for archaeological survey work in the Heritage Park. James Turner continued his genealogical research, making contact with descendants. Dorothy Hayes worked with the Charleston African American Heritage Council to organize community meetings, ensuring that the Black community of Charleston was informed and involved in every stage of the process. Finally, on a clear March morning, the team gathered at the Charleston Heritage Preservation Park. The location where the Whitmore plantation had once stood was now open grassland, with informational signs marking where various buildings had been. The main house was gone, destroyed by fire over a century ago. But the landscape still held traces of what had been, foundations buried beneath the grass, old trees that had witnessed unspeakable cruelties. The ground-penetrating radar equipment was set up near where the historical maps indicated the overseer's cabin had stood. A small crowd had gathered to witness the survey. Descendants, community members, local media who had gotten wind of the story. Dorothy Hayes stood near the front, her hands clasped tightly together. Dr. Lawson and her team methodically swept the radar equipment back and forth across the designated area. The machine translated underground densities into visual data on a laptop screen, showing what lay beneath the grass and soil. Sarah stood next to Marcus, both of them quiet, waiting. It took less than an hour. Dr. Lawson called everyone over, pointing to the laptop screen. There, approximately 4 feet below the current ground surface, directly where Isaiah's pointing finger had indicated 168 years ago, the ground-penetrating radar showed an unmistakable anomaly. The rectangular shape was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, the density patterns consistent with a buried human body and disturbed earth. Dorothy Hayes gasped, one hand coming up to cover her mouth. "He was telling the truth," she whispered. "Isaiah was telling the truth, and he made sure we could find her." Dr. Lawson looked around at the assembled group. "We've confirmed there's something there. The next step, if the community supports it, is to carefully excavate. This will take time. We need forensic archaeologists. We need to follow every protocol to preserve any remains with dignity and respect. We need to prepare for what we might find." "How long?" Dorothy asked. "Several weeks to organize the proper team and resources. Then the actual excavation, depending on what we find, could take days to weeks. We'll do it right. We owe Ruth that. We owe Isaiah that." Sarah looked across the grassland toward where the main plantation house had once stood. She thought about Isaiah, 9 years old, standing in front of a camera, holding perfectly still to ensure his testimony was captured. She thought about how much courage that must have taken, how much hope he must have had that someday someone would see and understand. "We see you, Isaiah," Sarah said quietly. "We see what you were trying to show us. And we're going to make sure everyone knows your story." The excavation began on April 15th, under cloudy skies that threatened rain. Dr. Patricia Lawson had assembled a team of forensic archaeologists, all experienced in the careful, reverent work of recovering human remains from historical sites. The Charleston African American Heritage Council had organized a spiritual ceremony before the work began, led by Reverend Thomas Banks from the historic Emmanuel AME Church. Dorothy Hayes stood at the edge of the excavation site, her hands holding those of 2 of her great-grandchildren, teenagers who had taken the day off from school to witness this moment. Around them gathered perhaps 100 community members, descendants, historians, students, media representatives. The atmosphere was somber, reverent, heavy with the weight of what they were about to uncover. Reverend Banks spoke in a rich, powerful voice that carried across the assembled crowd. "We gather here today to seek truth, to honor the dead, to acknowledge the terrible injustice that was slavery. A child named Isaiah tried to tell the truth 168 years ago. He pointed the way to justice, and he paid for that courage with his life. Today, we finish what he started. Today, we honor his testimony. Today, we say the names of those who were forgotten, and we promise that they will be forgotten no more." The excavation was painstakingly slow. Dr. Lawson and her team worked with brushes and small tools, removing dirt centimeter by centimeter, documenting everything with photographs and precise measurements. Sarah and Marcus watched from behind the barrier tape, both of them barely breathing as the hours passed and the excavation grew deeper. It was late afternoon when Dr. Lawson stood up, removing her gloves slowly. Her face was somber as she walked over to where Dorothy Hayes stood waiting. "We've found human remains," Dr. Lawson said quietly. "Female, based on pelvic structure. Adult, probably between 20 and 30 years old. The skeletal structure shows evidence of hard physical labor, compression fractures in the spine, signs of repetitive stress. And there's trauma to the skull, consistent with a violent blow." Dorothy made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Her great-grandchildren held her more tightly, all 3 of them with tears streaming down their faces. "She was murdered," Dorothy said. "It wasn't a question. The evidence strongly suggests homicidal trauma." "Yes," Dr. Lawson confirmed. "This woman was struck in the head with significant force. The burial appears to have been hasty, in an unmarked grave beneath the overseer's cabin. There are no burial goods, no coffin, nothing to identify her." "But we know who she was," Sarah said, stepping forward. "The historical records identify her as Ruth. Isaiah identified her. This is Ruth." Over the next several days, as forensic analysis continued, Sarah and Marcus intensified their historical research. They had been working on this for months now, but the discovery of the remains gave their search new urgency. They needed to know everything they could find out about Ruth, about Isaiah, about what had happened on that plantation in 1856. Marcus found the crucial document in the Charleston City archives at 2 in the morning during one of his increasingly frequent late-night research sessions. It was a letter, part of a personal correspondence collection donated to the archives in the 1970s. The letter was written by a Charleston physician named Dr. Edward Morrison in 1856, addressed to his brother in New York. Marcus's hands shook as he read the spidery handwriting. "I have today attended to the most disturbing matter of my career. I was called to the Whitmore plantation to examine an enslaved woman who had been found deceased. Robert Whitmore Jr. claimed she had fallen and struck her head, but my examination revealed injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. The skull fracture suggested a deliberate blow with a blunt instrument. Moreover, several enslaved persons, including a young boy, attempted to tell me that they had witnessed Robert Whitmore Jr. strike the woman in a fit of rage. Of course, I cannot credit such testimony legally, but my medical opinion is that this woman was murdered. I conveyed my concerns to Robert Whitmore Sr., but he dismissed me from the property and informed me my services would no longer be required. I am troubled deeply, but I know not what action I can take." Marcus immediately photographed the document with his phone and texted Sarah, despite the late hour, found the smoking gun. Doctor's letter confirms murder and mentions Isaiah as witness. Sarah arrived at the archives within an hour, having driven through the empty streets of Charleston at a speed that probably violated several traffic laws. Together, they read and reread the letter, documenting every detail. "This is it," Sarah said. "This is independent corroboration of Isaiah's testimony. A white physician, someone whose word would have been respected, confirming that Ruth was murdered and that Isaiah tried to tell people about it. And it shows exactly what happened to Isaiah after," Marcus said grimly. "He tried to tell the truth to a white doctor, someone he thought might help. Instead, the doctor was dismissed, and Isaiah became a problem that needed to be eliminated. That's why he disappeared from the records a year later." They worked through the night, compiling everything they had found. The restored photograph showing Isaiah pointing at the burial site. The court testimony from 1857 mentioning Isaiah's accusation. The doctor's letter confirming the murder. The genealogical research James Turner had conducted, tracing Ruth's likely descendants. The forensic evidence from the excavation proving homicidal trauma. When they presented their findings to the full team the next day, the room was silent for a long moment after Sarah finished speaking. Dr. Robinson was the first to respond. "This is one of the most significant pieces of evidence documenting slavery-era crime that I've encountered in my career. We have an enslaved child creating photographic evidence of a murder, corroborated by contemporary written testimony, confirmed by forensic archaeology. The story of resistance and testimony this represents is extraordinary." James Turner spread out several family trees he had been compiling. "I've been able to trace Ruth's family line. Based on the Whitmore plantation records, Ruth had 2 children who were sold away from the plantation before her death. I've found descendants of those children, 3 families currently living in South Carolina and Georgia. Dorothy Hayes's great-great-grandmother was Ruth's sister. There are at least 20 living people who are Ruth's direct descendants or related to her through her siblings." Dorothy looked at the family trees, tracing the lines with her finger. "All of us," she said softly. "All of us here because Ruth lived, because she survived long enough to have children before Robert Whitmore Jr. murdered her. And Isaiah, that brave child, he made sure we could find her and tell her story." The team decided that Ruth's remains should be reinterred in a formal ceremony, in a marked grave, with her name and her story told. They would also create a memorial to Isaiah, ensuring that his courage and his sacrifice were remembered. The planning took several weeks. They worked with genealogists to contact all of Ruth's known descendants. They coordinated with historians to create educational materials about Ruth and Isaiah's story. They partnered with local artists to design a memorial. And they made sure that everything was documented, creating a permanent record of this story that had been hidden for 168 years. Sarah found herself thinking often about Isaiah during those weeks. She wondered what his life had been like, what his hopes and dreams had been, whether he had understood that his photograph might someday bring justice for Ruth. She thought about the courage it took for a 9-year-old enslaved child to stand up to his oppressors, to insist on telling the truth even when he knew there would be terrible consequences. One evening, Sarah was working late in her office at the Smithsonian when Marcus stopped by, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place down the street. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "about why this story matters so much. I mean, we know it matters, obviously it matters. But I've been trying to articulate why it hits so hard." Sarah took the offered coffee gratefully. "Tell me your thoughts." "It's because Isaiah found a way to speak when he wasn't allowed to speak," Marcus said. "The entire system of slavery was designed to silence enslaved people, to deny their humanity, to make them invisible. They couldn't testify in court, their words weren't recorded, their stories weren't believed. But Isaiah found a camera, and he used it to tell the truth. He created evidence that could outlast the system that was trying to silence him. And 168 years later, we finally heard him." Sarah nodded slowly. "And not just heard him, we believed him. We verified his testimony. We confirmed that he was telling the truth. That's powerful. That's a kind of justice, even if it's delayed by almost 2 centuries. It makes me think about all the other voices we've lost," Marcus continued. "All the other people who tried to tell their stories and were silenced. How many other Isaiahs were there whose testimonies weren't preserved, whose truths were buried and forgotten?" "Thousands," Sarah said quietly. "Tens of thousands. Maybe more. That's why this work matters. That's why every photograph we restore, every document we preserve, every story we tell, it all matters. Because each one is a person whose voice was silenced, and we have the opportunity to help them speak again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking their coffee, both lost in thought. "Dorothy told me something yesterday," Marcus said. "She said that when she was a little girl, her grandmother used to tell her about Aunt Ruth who disappeared. That's all they knew. Aunt Ruth disappeared, and nobody knew what happened to her. The family had been searching for Ruth for 5 generations. 5 generations of wondering, of not knowing. And now finally, they have answers." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's what we do this work for. Not just for the historical record, not just for academia. For the families. For the descendants who deserve to know their ancestors' stories." The reinterment ceremony was scheduled for June 19th, Juneteenth, the holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. It seemed fitting that Ruth would be laid to rest with dignity and honor on a day celebrating freedom, that Isaiah's testimony would be acknowledged on a day honoring the resilience and courage of all those who had been enslaved. The June 19th sun rose hot and bright over Charleston, burning through the morning mist that rose from the harbor. By 9 a.m., when the ceremony was scheduled to begin, several hundred people had gathered at the Charleston Heritage Preservation Park. Ruth's descendants stood in a place of honor near the front, 23 people ranging in age from 5 to 82, all of them connected by blood to the woman whose murder had been hidden for 168 years. Dorothy Hayes had organized much of the ceremony with the Charleston African American Heritage Council. There would be music, prayers, testimonies, and readings. Several local schoolchildren had prepared presentations about Ruth and Isaiah's story, ensuring that the next generation would learn and remember. Sarah and Marcus stood toward the back of the crowd, both of them feeling the weight of this moment. The restored photograph of Isaiah had been enlarged and mounted on a display board, his pointing finger directing everyone's attention to the truth he had been brave enough to reveal. Next to it was a new photograph showing the excavation site, the carefully preserved remains, the evidence that Isaiah had been telling the truth all along. The cemetery where Ruth would be reinterred was adjacent to the Heritage Park, a small plot that had been established specifically to provide proper burial for enslaved people whose remains were discovered during archaeological work. Ruth's grave would be marked with a beautiful headstone that read, "Ruth, died 1856. Murdered but not forgotten. Her truth spoken by a child named Isaiah. May they both rest in peace and power." Next to Ruth's grave was a memorial stone for Isaiah. Since his remains had never been found and likely never would be, the memorial would serve as a place where people could come to honor his memory, to acknowledge his courage, to ensure he was not forgotten. Reverend Banks stood to speak, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. We are here today to correct an injustice. 168 years ago, a woman named Ruth was murdered. Her killer faced no consequences. She was buried in shame, in an unmarked grave, denied the dignity that every human being deserves in death. Her murder was witnessed by a child named Isaiah, who tried to tell the truth. For his courage, Isaiah was silenced, killed, buried in an unknown location where we cannot honor him except in memory and spirit. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. But today, Reverend Banks continued, his voice rising with power, today we say that truth cannot be killed. Today we say that courage matters. Today we say that Ruth's life had meaning, that her death was a crime, that she deserves to be remembered with honor. Today we say that Isaiah's courage, his determination to testify to the truth, was not in vain. He spoke across the centuries and we heard him. He pointed the way to justice and we followed. Dorothy Hayes stepped forward to speak, her voice trembling but strong. My great-great-grandmother was Ruth's sister. For 5 generations, my family has told stories about Ruth who disappeared. We didn't know what happened to her. We didn't know where she was buried. We carried that loss, that not knowing, for 168 years. Today, that loss ends. Today, we know the truth. Today, we can lay our sister, our ancestor, our family member to rest with the dignity she deserved. One of Dorothy's great-grandchildren, a 16-year-old girl named Amara, read a poem she had written for Ruth and Isaiah. Her voice was clear and confident despite her young age. They tried to bury your story with your bones. They tried to silence the child who pointed at truth. But bones speak. Photographs testify. Justice delayed is still justice. Ruth, you are remembered. Isaiah, you are honored. We are here because you lived. We speak because you refused to be silent. Your courage echoes through the generations. Your truth sets us free. The crowd erupted in applause, many people openly weeping. Sarah found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the power of this moment, by the knowledge that their work, her work, Marcus's work, the work of so many people, had led to this. Ruth was being honored. Isaiah was being remembered. Truth was being acknowledged. The actual reinterment was conducted with solemn ceremony. Ruth's remains, carefully placed in a beautiful casket donated by a local funeral home, were lowered into the ground. Her descendants each placed flowers on the casket. A choir from Emmanuel AME Church sang old spirituals, songs that Ruth herself might have sung, songs of sorrow and hope and freedom. After the ceremony, as people slowly dispersed, Sarah and Marcus found themselves standing in front of Isaiah's memorial stone. The inscription read, Isaiah, child of courage. Born approximately 1847, died approximately 1858. He pointed the way to truth. He refused to be silent. His testimony brought justice. May his courage inspire us all. Do you think he knew? Marcus asked quietly. When he posed for that photograph, when he held that pointing position long enough for the image to be captured, do you think he knew that someday someone would see and understand? Sarah thought about it, looking at Isaiah's face in the enlarged photograph nearby. That serious expression, those old eyes in a young face, that determined gesture of pointing, of showing, of testifying. I think he hoped, Sarah said finally. I think he hoped that someday, somehow, someone would see what he was trying to show. That's what hope is, right? It's believing that the truth matters even when everything in your world tells you it doesn't. Isaiah had hope. And 168 years later, his hope was vindicated. A young woman approached them, introducing herself as Dr. Jennifer Washington, a professor of African American history at the University of South Carolina. I wanted to thank you both, she said. This story, Ruth and Isaiah's story, it's going to change how we teach about slavery, about resistance, about the ways enslaved people fought back against the system that oppressed them. We usually talk about resistance in terms of rebellions, runaways, work slowdowns. But this, using a camera to create evidence, using technology to testify, this is resistance too. This is agency. This is an enslaved child refusing to let his oppressors control the narrative. Sarah felt a surge of pride. That's what we hoped. That this story would matter not just as a specific case, but as an example of the kinds of resistance we need to look for, the kinds of voices we need to listen for in the historical record. Over the following months, Ruth and Isaiah's story spread widely. Sarah and Marcus published their research in academic journals, detailing the AI restoration process, the historical investigation, the archaeological findings. The story was covered by major news outlets, trending on social media, discussed in classrooms across the country. Several documentary filmmakers reached out about creating a full-length film. The Smithsonian decided to create a permanent exhibition about the case, using Isaiah's restored photograph as the centerpiece. The University of Maryland's AI restoration program received increased funding and attention, with researchers working to restore thousands more damaged historical photographs, each one potentially containing lost stories waiting to be revealed. Dorothy Hayes became an advocate for other families searching for lost ancestors, working with genealogists and historians to help other people find their family stories. She gave talks at schools and community centers, showing Isaiah's photograph, telling Ruth's story, emphasizing the importance of remembering and honoring those who had been enslaved. Sarah found herself thinking differently about her work after this case. Every photograph she scanned, every damaged image she submitted for restoration, every historical document she preserved, each one was now imbued with the possibility that it might contain another Isaiah, another person trying to tell their story, another testimony waiting to be heard. 1 year after the reinterment ceremony, on another June 19th, Sarah and Marcus returned to Charleston for a commemoration event. The memorial site had become a place of pilgrimage, with people regularly visiting to pay their respects to Ruth and Isaiah, to leave flowers, to stand in quiet reflection about the past and its continuing impact on the present. Dorothy Hayes had organized an event bringing together descendants of enslaved people from multiple South Carolina plantations, creating a community of people united by their shared history and their commitment to remembering and honoring their ancestors. Sarah was asked to speak at the event, and she stood before the crowd feeling the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that the words she chose mattered. 1 year ago, Sarah began, we laid Ruth to rest with honor and dignity. We acknowledged Isaiah's courage and sacrifice. We told a story that had been buried for 168 years. But the work isn't finished. Ruth and Isaiah's story is one story among millions. There are millions of people who were enslaved in this country whose stories have never been told, whose graves are unmarked, whose voices have been silenced. She paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing faces young and old, people of all backgrounds who had come to honor this history. Our job, all of our jobs, is to keep looking, keep listening, keep telling the stories. Every photograph we restore might contain another testimony. Every document we preserve might hold another voice. Every grave we find might return someone's ancestor to their family. The work is hard. The stories are often painful. But they matter. Every single one of them matters. Marcus stepped forward to join her. Isaiah was 9 years old when he pointed at that truth. 9 years old, and he refused to be silent even though he knew the consequences. Think about the courage that took. Think about the hope he must have had that someday, someone would see and understand. We have a responsibility to that courage, to that hope. We have a responsibility to see, to understand, to tell the truth. Dorothy Hayes spoke last, her voice strong and clear. Ruth was my ancestor. Isaiah gave his life to tell her story. For 168 years, my family carried the pain of not knowing what happened to her. Now we know. Now we can heal. That's what truth does, it heals. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Truth makes healing possible. She turned to face the memorial stones, placing her hand on Ruth's headstone. Thank you, Ruth, for surviving long enough to give us life. Thank you, Isaiah, for being brave enough to tell the truth. We will make sure your stories are never forgotten. We will make sure your courage inspires generations to come. As the sun set over Charleston that evening, Sarah stood alone for a moment in front of Isaiah's memorial. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first moment of seeing the damaged photograph in the archive basement to this moment, 1 year later, with Ruth honored and Isaiah remembered. She thought about all the other photographs still waiting to be restored, all the other stories still waiting to be told. She thought about the power of truth, the importance of memory, the responsibility of those who came after to honor those who came before. "We heard you, Isaiah," Sarah said quietly, placing her hand on the cool stone of his memorial. "We saw what you were pointing at. We told Ruth's story. We told your story. And we'll keep telling stories, keep searching for truth, keep honoring the courage it takes to testify even when the whole world is trying to silence you." The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above, the same stars that had shone down on Isaiah 168 years ago when he stood in front of a camera and pointed at truth. The same stars that would shine down on future generations who would come to this place, who would learn these stories, who would carry forward the work of remembering, honoring, and seeking justice. In the morning, Sarah would return to Washington, D.C., back to the archive basement, back to the thousands of photographs still waiting to be scanned and restored. Marcus would continue his research, tracing other stories, finding other voices, ensuring that the historical record included those who had been systematically excluded. Dorothy and Ruth's other descendants would continue their lives, carrying their ancestors' story with them, no longer burdened by not knowing, able finally to heal from wounds 168 years old. And somewhere in the vast digital archives of the Smithsonian, Isaiah's photograph would remain, his pointing finger forever directing attention toward truth, toward justice, toward the importance of bearing witness even when the cost is high. Future researchers, future students, future truth seekers would see that photograph and understand. One child's courage can echo through the centuries. One act of testimony can eventually bring justice. Truth, even when buried, even when hidden, even when denied, has a way of emerging into the light. Ruth and Isaiah's story had been told, but it was not finished. It would live on in every person who learned it, in every researcher who was inspired by it, in every act of courage it encouraged. The story was now part of the historical record, permanent and preserved, ensuring that neither Ruth nor Isaiah would ever be forgotten again. As Sarah walked away from the memorial site that evening, she carried with her the knowledge that the work of justice is never truly finished, but that every small act of truth-telling, every restoration of a photograph, every story preserved and shared, contributed to a larger project of honoring the dead and giving voice to the silenced. Isaiah had pointed the way. Ruth had been found. The truth had been told. And the work continued as it always would, as it always must, for as long as there were stories left untold and voices waiting to be heard.